Okay, thank you very much. Heiner, Bente, and I will be working on this together. I will be giving this, but he's free to interrupt me, argue with me, dispute, whatever he wants to do at any step along the line. Let me start by telling you that what we're trying to do is impossible. Okay, let's acknowledge that from the beginning, because it'll make it a lot easier in the discussions if we realize that there is no perfect set of indicators, no matter what they are or how you devise them. There's always going to be judgment required when you end up at the end of the game, no matter whether it be indices that are inaccurate, initial data that's inaccurate, simplifications and glorious models, whatever. There are always going to be problems in this analysis, which means that at the end you're going to have something that you have to think about. I wish it were not so, but that's the way it is, and we should keep that in mind as we go along. Okay. What is efficiency? Well, the more I've talked about it, the more I think it has a lot similar with pornography. That is, we all know what's pornographic, but if you ask any two of us to define it precisely, then we begin to argue. What is it exactly? How many inches? Whatever. It's something that requires a great deal of discussion almost immediately after we say we know what it is. Basically, what we mean is that we're comparing outputs and inputs, either a net difference or a ratio. It is unusually complex to do this for railways because railways don't produce one product. They produce a lot of products, all at the same time. Passenger services have a lot of subproducts. Freight services have a lot of subproducts by commodity, unit train, block train. You name it. There are many, many, many products, and today there are many railways who produce infrastructure access as well. So on the output side, it is very complex. On the input side, we have a lot of inputs, labor, track, assets. Very few of these inputs can actually directly be related to an output. For example, locomotives produce passenger service and they produce freight service. The same track carries passenger trains and freight trains, and we can't clearly separate one for the other except in those railways that are only freight or only passenger and only hauling one kind of freight. For example, a mining railway in Australia comes close to being a simple example. The other problem is there are varying attitudes toward reporting. What I mean by that is that most railroads don't want you to know what they know, so they don't tell you. Or in many cases, they deliberately don't produce information that would permit a better stratification of outputs and inputs. This is well known. There are a lot of measures of efficiency. The ones that we tend to think of and we've thought of in the past are what I would call technical measures. That is where you're comparing physical outputs and inputs, such as outputs such as tons or passenger kilometers, ton kilometers, gross ton kilometers, train kilometers. Those are things that are you can measure. There are consumed inputs like labor, materials, and energy, and then there are asset inputs, right-of-way, locomotives, rolling stock, buildings, all of those things. They're different categories. Now, that's technical. That's the ones we have tended to think about, but those aren't all. There are financial indices of efficiency. These are always measured in currencies like euros or dollars, and they can be things like output per like cost for a ton kilometer rather than just labor per ton kilometer. And they measure things like markets or customers. They measure things like operating ratio, for example, where you're comparing total financial inputs and total financial outputs with values on them. And things like prices, which can be particularly important. And then at another level, one which we haven't dealt with but should start thinking about dealing with more explicitly is what I would call economic. That is, what's the value of the social outputs? Urban form, improve safety, pollution, reduce noise, and the cost of the social inputs such as congestion or lack of congestion, noise, or pollution. Really, that's the measure we should be using, but rarely can we do that for a lot of reasons. Pressing the wrong button here. We will discuss this many times today, but I think there are two dimensions of efficiency measures. One of these is cross-sectional comparisons. That's where we're comparing a bunch of railways at one point in time. I want to stress that we cannot use a single index, never, because railways are quite different and they will always argue it. You can't compare me with them because I have more ton kilometers per kilometer than they do, and therefore the whole analysis is invalid. This is argument number one that you always receive. So you have to have multiple indices from a number of different angles before you can start forming a pattern of these things. But again, I stress a pattern, not a conclusion. You can think of this in a sense as the way a doctor approaches a diagnosis, because what the doctor wants to know is what's your temperature. They don't stop there. What's your blood pressure? Let me see the blood test. Let me see the urine test. I want to see your x-rays. And they don't want to just see those. They want to see them over time. And that's why we talk about time series also being critical, because it's entirely possible that you might have looked efficient today, but that you may be half as efficient as you were 10 years ago. And I want to know that. I want to know the full set of all of these comparisons before you can begin to decide what's wrong with this patient or how does this patient compare with others. Another point that needs to be stressed, there is no such thing as absolute efficiency. If I tell you 500,000 ton kilometers per kilometer, what does that mean? You got to compare it with somebody else who's carrying 2 million. So we have to have cross-sectional many. We need time series for every one of them, and we need a set of benchmarks on all of those before you can begin to form the pattern that says this railway is more efficient than this railway, and begin to say, well, in what area does the efficiency or lack of efficiency lie? Aha, whoops.
One too many? Yeah.
This is like my garage door opener. What's wrong with indices? Why do we have problems with them? Well, the first thing we have to do, and this we are often not very careful about, is deciding what we're going to use them for. Some indices will do some things, others will do other things, and if you don't know what you want to do with them, you tend to get a huge number of indices, and then you have no idea which one to use. It's like the difference between numbers and information. Information is a number with a purpose, an idea, something to do with it. We could use it for analysis or research. This is something dear to the heart of our economists. We can use it for investment analysis. What do we get for this? We can use it for public policy and budgeting. That is, where do we put our public money on a railway as opposed to highways, or this railway as opposed to this railway. And we can use it for regulation. And I put a parenthesis there. The U.S. Surface Transportation Board in the Staggers Act of 1980 established a standard of revenue of a movement divided by its variable cost. That ratio determines whether the shipment is potentially subject to regulation. One number, a ratio. Now, if you believe that is really accurate, you would have put a lot of lawyers out of business. But the fact is that they are using an index of efficiency or performance, a numerical one, that guides regulation in a very significant way. A problem is the availability and the public use of data. I stress that word public. Many railways publish very little. Others railways have a lot and don't make it public. A problem that I think is quite serious. It doesn't It's not clear to me why a public railway owned by the public, operated by the public, governed by the public can refuse to provide public information to those people who would like to have it. But they do. And that limits severely, in some cases, the data that we have to do any of this. Data quality, I have spent my years with railway data, and I can guarantee you that 1997 report for the railway and the 1998 report for the railway for the same thing will be different. So it's never completely comparable. You always worry about the accuracy. You always worry, in many cases, where it's not complete. So there's always a little shaky there, and this will always be true in railway data. That's the bad news. The bad news is that railway data is typically infinitely better than the data you have on highways or the data you have on air, where you know almost nothing about what's moving on highways, what volume, what commodities from where to where. So railways at least potentially furnish better data. And then the problem that we ran into in this study is what's called cutting your sails to fit your cloth. If you don't have the data, you may as well not try to formulate a sophisticated index, because you won't get there. If you have, so you have to, it's a feedback process between what you'd like to have, what you actually have, what you can actually develop, what data you can provide to support it, and it changes over time. Okay, the data we collected, we collected data on 81 railways, 26 countries, 41 years. And I want to immediately nod to our UIC colleague and saying that not all, but much of what we have here is from one or the other versions of UIC reports, because that is the only common source of most international railway data. If you want specific data, you have to go to the individual railway. And we didn't want to do that. Here we wanted to see what you can do with data that is more or less readily available. We have data on inputs and assets like staff, line kilometers, locomotives, multiple unit equipment, wagons, etc. We have data on outputs, passengers, passenger kilometers, passenger revenue, gross ton kilometers, and train kilometers. Same for freight. Total operating cost and total operating revenue as defined in the statistics. And I caution you that those definitions may not be the same for every railway within the sample. We hope they are. We have modal shares from OECD that show rail passenger service as opposed to automobiles, or rail freight as opposed to rail and truck, or all modes. And I added this thought there. I have a copy of all of the data that we have. If anybody wants it, I can provide it to you. The raw data. We developed a series of indices. Some of basic use characteristics, like how big is the railway, how many people, how long is it, what are its outputs, some productivity ratios of line density, traffic units per kilometer, gross ton kilometers per kilometer, train kilometers per kilometer. These are the traditional measures. Productivity measures of rolling stock, and there is one particularly difficult problem here because locomotives are not used just for passengers, they're not used for freight, and many railways have a form of locomotive called a multiple unit wagon or coach that is sort of like a locomotive. So the only way we could think of to do this was to adjust the number of multiple units to produce an equivalent locomotive, which I did by dividing by 6. If you want to divide by 5, feel free. I'm not sure it changes the numbers very much, but an assumption is necessary. Otherwise, you get nothing out of comparisons of locomotive productivity. Productivities of staff, financial operating ratio, revenue to operating cost, average revenues for passenger fare and freight tariffs. These are stated in 2011 purchasing power parity adjusted US dollars. Now, I will outline the fact that that is a heroic calculation because it involves an awful lot of conversions. Nevertheless, I think that the end result is interesting and useful because it does give you, for the first time I've ever seen it, a useful comparison of the average passenger and freight revenues for all of the railways in the sample over since 1970. So we can see what happened in various transitions. We have rail modal share, as I said, from OEC statistics, and we have the time series that we have is for every variable, but what we presented for was for passenger kilometers, ton kilometers, operating ratio, and some of the labor productivities, and the freight revenue and passenger revenue averages and market shares. It's available for all, but this is all we presented. What about the data? This is verse 1 of the hymn that we will be singing today. Data quality has real problems. It's not always comparable. It's not always accurate. It's often incomplete. It is not, in the most cases, enforced. That is, if I want to report, fine. If I don't report, nobody comes around and argues with me. There are severe restrictions on confidentiality. Which means that there are limitations on what you can do with publicly available data. This is not surprising, but it has to be recognized. The U.S. Surface Transportation Board statistics of Class 1 railroads and the carload waybill sample, and I want to emphasize that, would be a good model for anyone to look at to see, well, if I could get what I wanted, what would I get? This series of information, the statistics of Class 1 railroads, has been published in the same format with the same definitions since about 1915 or 1916, every year. And the railways must file it, and the filer must swear under oath that the data are accurate. So they have to be complete and they have to be accurate within the limits of the definitions, etc. But I want to highlight that other point, carload waybill sample, because in the U.S. every year a sample is taken of all of the waybills. These are the shipment documents for freight. It shows where did it start, where did it end, what was the commodity, what was the distance, what was the tariff, a lot of which wagon was used, a lot of information. That's the only way you can get closer to what is the revenue by commodity, or what is the revenue per ton mile by commodity, or what is the average length of haul by commodity as opposed to just overall. It's fantastically useful information. There are limitations on it about which I've written several articles because the railways are allowed to conceal the revenue from contract tariffs. But other than that, the information is as it is stated. There are other industry sources like the AAR or the Railway Association of Canada that have useful information, but they are mostly compilations of data taken from regulators. The ORR data, I think, is also very useful, but it doesn't cover freight operators. And I'd love to see better what about their freight operators. UIC data are good. They are the fallback option in most cases. But there are gaps. They don't make available waybill data, although I think they have it. They just do not make it available. And railways often don't comply. There'll be big gaps. France has chosen not to report data to the UIC for a number of years. Sweden has decided that green cargo need not report its operations to the UIC, so many of the new freight railways have just fallen off the map. You don't know anything about them. The EU, surprisingly to me, has no central source of data, and it often doesn't enforce reporting mandates to support policy. This is not new. We had exactly the same discussion in a report I wrote for Steve in 2007. The EU has policies, and it does not require collecting and reporting information that can tell whether those policies are being implemented. This is very clear. And you have to ask yourself, what's the point of having policies if you don't have the information to enforce them? What are you getting out of this process? But that is a significant problem with the data. So what did we learn? Step 1, phase 1. There are some really efficient, quote, railways in the world. The U.S. Class 1 freight railways, Canada, China, Very high volumes, very high productivity indices, low prices, very good modal shares. But I want to stress a point here, and that is that Amtrak and VIA, which are the passenger carriers nationally owned, are very different in their performance. So while you see the deregulated private freight railways moving really well, the publicly owned passenger railways have been stagnant, have not really changed things very much over the years. So very difference in behavior, and that is because, as we'll come to it, the Staggers Act, which deregulated freight railways, changed the rules of the game, but the rules of the game for Amtrak have been the same all along. That is, find your congressman, get as much support as you can, and survive year to year. There are some very efficient passenger railways. Japanese railway hauls immense volumes, and they do it very effectively. Mixed railways, when I mean mixed, I mean balance between passenger and freight, tend to be in the middle. Switzerland tends to look very good in almost all areas, the SBB. OSE, Greece, and CIE, Ireland, are at the bottom of most indices. I don't think this will surprise anybody, but this is where it is. Nothing in the time trends that would foster optimism about most EU railways. You can find growth in passenger in some cases, but you rarely find growth in freight, and you rarely find real strong improvements in economic performance. It's just not there. Can efficiency be changed? Yes, it certainly can. We have some examples here. Deregulation of U.S. freight, privatization of the Canadian National, and U.S. deregulation in Canada. I mention that because two systems are connected, and the Canadians really have to follow what happens in the United States, and they do. Breakup and privatization in Japan. Restructuring and franchising in the UK, though I'm immediately going to acknowledge that Chris and Andrew will carry this a lot further than I'm going to. The EU results are mixed. Some do sort of well, some do not. There are no clear winners and losers. UK had the clearest results, and it's not clear whether the EU directives have actually been implemented. That is, they've been there since 1991. But in major terms, it isn't clear that there really are any even yet. Here's what happened in the United States. I've drawn a line at deregulation, and you can see that average tariffs are there in blue, and constant 2010 dollars fell by more than half over a period of 20 years, 30 years. They've trended upward recently, but that's because basically the railways have run out of capacity, and much more important, it's because the highways have run out of capacity, and the railways are able to price up their traffic a little bit, which they are appropriately doing. But notice that at the same time that this happened, the operating ratio for the railway actually fell. That is, they are much better off financially than they were. So prices fell by half, and profitability went up. And the reason for that is that costs and productivity fell even faster than the tariffs did. So this is one case, and it's generally acknowledged. You can't argue with this. It worked. Here's one that's a little less well known. Canada. Two things happened in Canada. One is U.S. deregulation, and the other is the privatization of the Canadian National. The Canadian National was always a public corporation. The Canadian Pacific was always private. Canadian National was privatized in 1996. You see what happened is that U.S. deregulation began driving down the average tariffs, but with privatization of CN and CP, CN had always been lower in productivity than CP. After privatization, the places changed, And then both of them rapidly improved in their productivity, and the operating ratio for the system fell. So prices again fell, but profitability of the two railways went up because productivity went up so much. Japanese national railways, this is about as abrupt a change as you can imagine. And what happened is in 1987, the government took the old monolithic publicly owned Japanese railway and they broke it up into 6 passenger railways and 1 freight railway. And they sold on the stock exchange the largest 3 passenger railways. What happened was the labor force fell rapidly, labor productivity went up, and as you can see, the operating ratio, which I consider to be a good first measure of financial efficiency, the operating ratio fell dramatically, and it has been stable, and the prices have been essentially stable ever since. Now I'm getting on shakier ground, but I will just say this one quickly and keep going. Look what happened to traffic in the UK upon the privatization. Dramatic, that's an elbow. That's a dramatic change in the trends, both in passenger and in freight. Passengers now are carrying more passenger miles than they did since World War II, when there was no automobile traffic. It has been argued that that has nothing to do with anything except the economy was growing so dramatically that anything would have done the same. I don't think that's true. If you look at the green line, the economy, that trend is very smooth. But the trends in the traffic are not smooth. So something happened. Now, whether it was privatization, whether it was merely restructuring, whether it was a lot of other things, I can't say, but it is a discontinuous point, that's for sure. I expect you to memorize these numbers. They're not so easy to see, and I'm sorry, but what I've done is I've plotted, Kirchner did a series of studies sponsored by the DB on the implementation of the EU rail reform rules, and he broke those down as between law, access, and actual competition. And I've shown them there first in terms of by year, 2004, 2002, 2004, 2007, and 2011. And you can see that, according to Kirchner, that the liberalization was proceeding, although it's very interesting if you look at the red circle on the lower part, you can see that, according to Kirchner, liberalization was greater in freight than it was in passengers, which means that countries continued to protect their passenger systems even though nominally they allowed competition for freight. I'm going to use that word nominally. If you look on the right-hand side, I've then drawn, the red circle shows the UK. The UK is the only country which Kirchner considered to be, quote, advanced in competition, actual competition, not changing the law or changing the nominal terms, but actual competition. There are 4 other countries that were considered on schedule. Again, these are terms that are subject to interpretation. 4 other countries that appeared to be on schedule: Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, but I think that's partly because they decided to sell their freight railways and get out of the business and let Germany buy them, as they did in the UK. And then notice where France is, quite far down to the bottom. If you look at these numbers, it is hard to conclude that the EU rail reform has actually had an impact on competition. If Kirchner's right, and one can argue with his numbers, I'm sure, there is a certain amount of judgment involved as well as numbers. But what this says, if it's right, is that the reason why we don't see a hell of a lot of progress in the indices of efficiency in the EU railways, however formulated, is because not much has changed from the EU's rules. And maybe something else could have changed, but not from the EU. So what do we learn from this verse 2? I believe that broad indices can be developed, and I think they're useful. But if you want to go beyond that to talk about an individual country, then you have to go beyond these indices. That's clear. The results are indicative, but they're not dispositive. That means if you use the indices, look at the time series, you can form a picture that tells you, well, there are potential problems here, or this appears to have worked. This appears to be making progress. And it helps you to zero in on where the problems might be. But it will not tell you whether DB is more efficient at maintaining 1 kilometer of electrified track as compared with somebody else. It wasn't intended to do that, and it won't tell you that. We must have better data. We need to define the objectives more clearly. We need complete and mandatory reporting. I had a question, should we add socioeconomic data to railway reporting? Right now, there are no reports from the railways of how many tons of carbon they emitted or how many tons of carbon they claim that somebody else didn't emit because of them. We don't have explicit figures on the value of human life that they have either extinguished or saved. There are a lot of other economic indices that they could report explicitly, and if nothing else, make life easier on economists who are trying to study them. That wouldn't be hard. It could be defined, and it would make the reporting better. And the final issue here is, should there be EU-mandated data with or without UIC? I say with UIC because I think UIC, were it to be the EU's instrument for doing so, would be fine. They have well-established data definitions. Maybe they would modify them slightly and make them more complex, but they're there. Or if the EU regulator decides that in order to carry out the functions of the EU policy and actually make them work, they'd like to have the data they need in order to do that, then I think an EU-mandated reporting system like that of the STB in the United States is going to be unavoidable someday. And it would be good to get it started because we talked about this in 2007 and the response was we can't do anything because this is subsidiarity and we can't tell our member countries how to enforce our directives. But it hasn't happened. And so if the next stage is to actually enforce the directives, then some form of mandated data in a consistent format would appear to me to have really great value. Thank you.